Okay, so in the second video, I mentioned that Luther basically was rescued or kidnapped, so to speak, by his own secular lord and spirited away to Saxony, where he was placed in a castle called the Wartburg and sort of was in hiding there, meanwhile writing all sorts of letters and theological treatises and doing a translation of the Bible into German from the Latin and various other activities like that. In the meantime, his books were getting picked up by printers and reproduced by the hundreds and thousands and getting read by people all over Europe who were being inspired by this to say, yes, these are the kinds of changes we need, these are the new kinds of ideas that we need, these are the ways we need to reform our churches. One of the things that this meant was that the Protestant Reformation was not centrally organized in any way, right? Luther was not directing a Reformation telling everybody else what to do. Other people would write to him and ask for his advice, and he would write back saying, you know, here's what I think about this or that, or here's what you ought to do. But he didn't have any kind of authority. There was no Lutheran counter-church under Luther's direction, with Luther as a kind of a pope telling all the various Protestants what to do, nor was anybody else organizing activity. Rather, what you had were different reformers basically inspired by Luther or having similar ideas of their own to Luther, popping up in various parts of Europe, reading his books, reading the books of other people, his students and friends and other people associated with him, and reading the Bible themselves and coming up with their own ideas about how to interpret the Bible, and introducing reforms of their own as they talk to local confraternities, local noblemen, local church councils about, you know, hey, we need to introduce church reforms here, and maybe, you know, we ought to think about what a reform should look like. So there's no one big single organized movement where everybody's doing the same thing. There never was. There was no one unified Protestant church. Instead, Protestant is just an adjective to say churches which are following these kinds of reform ideas inspired by Luther and driven by these ideas of sola scriptura, by the scripture alone, and sola fide, by faith alone. Okay, this is the sort of central ideas there. So you get lots of different reform movements going on, lots of different Protestant churches in different parts of Europe popping up all kinds of simultaneously. As they talk back and forth with each other, and their leaders meet with each other and have conversations or send letters back and forth to each other, one of the major topics of conversation among them comes to be what they call adiaphora, okay, which is a Greek term, which means the stuff that doesn't matter, okay, the adiaphora. In other words, what's going on with these Protestants is they all agree that the Bible ought to be the only authority for deciding how church ought to run, okay? You know, you got the Bible you look at the Bible tells you what your Christianity ought to look like. The question is, though, there's lots of stuff the Bible doesn't talk about, okay? I mean, especially the New Testament. It's really not that big of a book. Just a couple dozen letters and, you know, a handful of Gospels and things like that. You compare it to, say, the Hindu scriptures or something that just, you know, bookshelves and bookshelves and bookshelves worth of stuff. The Christian scriptures, there's really, you know, as rich as they are, it's really pretty brief, and there's an awful lot of stuff that they don't mention. And so this raises the question for these various Protestant leaders, what do you do with the stuff that the Bible doesn't talk about? Let me give you an example. Ministers, pastors, wearing robes, right? Is it a good thing, a bad thing? Does it matter for a member of the clergy to wear a distinct set of clothing that marks them out as a member of the clergy? Now, they all agree there should be such a thing. Pretty much all of them agree there should be such a thing as clergy. You know, they read in the Bible, they see apostles and preachers and people like that, and they agree the church ought to continue to have officers, elders and deacons and so forth who are going to run the churches. But should these people be, you know, wearing special clothing to mark them out? And here you get some differences of opinion. Luther himself, he tends to take the approach that if the Bible doesn't mention something, and if it's not contradictory to something that the Bible does teach, then it's okay. You can allow it. Okay, so in a Lutheran church, if you want to have the priest wearing a special robe, that's fine. Okay, it doesn't make any difference. Bible doesn't condemn it. It doesn't seem to contradict anything that's in the Bible. And so it's okay to have all these adiaphora, all this stuff that doesn't matter, as long as you don't start saying it's essential, as long as you don't start saying God requires us to wear the right robes, it's okay for the priest to wear robes. Okay, various other things like that. Can you celebrate holy days? You know, should you celebrate Christmas? You know, the Bible has our birth story for Jesus Christ, but it never says thou shalt celebrate Christmas. So is it okay to celebrate Christmas or not? Luther would say that it's not contradicting anything that's in the Bible, so sure, why not? You know, you can have Christmas celebrations, that kind of a thing. However, other Protestant leaders take a different approach to that. Their concern is that people tend to get on a slippery slope where they're going to tend to drag away from what they thought was the pure spiritual message of the gospel, and they're going to, if you don't sort of watch things really carefully, they're going to start slipping in and bringing in all this stuff that ultimately is going to turn into Catholicism all over again. Is going to turn into all the stuff they just reformed. Okay, they sort of say, this is how we got into this in the first place, and how we got into this corrupt church that needed all this reforming, you know, is by allowing all this stuff in that didn't seem to be contradictory to the Bible, and then that other stuff wound up kind of taking over. So other reformers were more radical than Luther was, and they would go so far as to say, if the Bible doesn't teach it or instruct you to do it, then the church cannot instruct you to do it either. Okay? Now, there may be other things in society. Of course, the Bible doesn't talk about anything, and, you know, society as a whole may need to have, you know, lots of rules and practices and customs that aren't in the Bible. But as far as these reformers would say, the church cannot go and introduce practices or allow practices to be happening or things to be taught in the church that are not explicitly directly drawn from the Bible itself. So they would say the Bible does not say preachers ought to wear special robes, and therefore it would be a sin for the preachers to go wearing special robes, okay, that make them look different from everybody else in the congregation. Okay, so a more strict kind of approach. That stricter type of approach especially is associated with reformers like John Calvin, kind of a second-generation reformer. He was French. He started writing in the 1530s, about 20 years after Luther, a younger man, and fled from France, which had a Catholic king, as we've seen, wound up in the city of Geneva, which is in Switzerland, independent from France, but French-speaking, so it was a place where he could feel at home. And the town council at Geneva had kicked the bishop out of the town, the Catholic bishop, had introduced a Lutheran-style reform, but didn't really have somebody to organize things and provide leadership there, and Calvin kind of became the guy who wound up as the most influential figure in Geneva's Reformation. We met him in Bake's book. It mentioned Geneva as the sort of home base, sending out Protestant preachers across France to sort of encourage Huguenots and build up a French Protestant church, which wound up getting involved in civil wars and so forth in France. So for Calvin, agreeing with Luther on sola scriptura, but taking a much stricter view of what sola scriptura means. It doesn't just mean you can't do anything that contradicts the Bible. It means don't do anything in the church which the Bible does not explicitly tell you to do. Okay, so don't wear special robes. Don't have images and pictures in the church. Calvin thought that would lead you into idolatry and worshiping idols that would violate the second commandment. None of these holidays that aren't mentioned in the Bible. Calvinists would say you shouldn't, the strict Calvinists would say you shouldn't be worshiping, you shouldn't be celebrating Christmas or Easter or things like that. They commemorate events that are talked about in the Bible, but the Bible doesn't say you ought to have an annual holiday to commemorate this, and therefore a strict Calvinist would not celebrate those kinds of things, that sort of thing. So Calvinism, very strict version. Calvinists were also noted for a particular interpretation of the Bible they had, which is a focus on predestination. The idea there being that God had decided from the beginning of time who would be saved and who would be damned, and Calvinists built a fair amount of their theology around that idea, which was controversial between them and some of the other Protestants who didn't draw the same ideas out of the Bible that the Calvinists did, which raised one of the major issues for Protestantism. Everybody agrees the Bible is the authority, but then it turns out that they can't all agree on what the Bible actually means or what it actually says, and that leads to lots of perpetuating these divisions and distinctions between different Protestant groups. Another area where the Reform takes a somewhat different direction is England. In England, the decision to go with the Reformation is very political. King Henry VIII famously wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. The Pope would not grant the divorce, would not grant a dispensation to allow them to divorce, and so Henry decided the solution was to deny that the Pope had authority over these things and go Protestant. In England, it was a particularly controversial kind of a thing because there wasn't quite as much widespread support for Protestantism in England as there was in other parts of Europe. So it was kind of pushed through by the royal authority. And also Henry wanted to be free of the Pope's authority, but he wasn't really all that interested in other kinds of church reform. He wanted to keep the English church as traditional and Catholic looking as he could. He liked bishops, he liked saints, he liked stained glass windows in the churches and all this kind of a thing. But once he had broken with the Pope, then the sort of loyal Catholic churchmen refused to serve him. Henry declared himself head of the church, and so a lot of people fled England to go to the continent after that, which meant that the only people Henry could find to run his churches for him were more thoroughgoing Protestants than he himself was. What that meant was in England you wound up with a sort of a constant pendulum swing and a long-running dispute over just how Protestant, just how radical was the Church of England going to be. Was it going to be a very kind of conservative, traditional-looking type of a church that was still going to have bishops and archbishops and priests and all the rest, or was it going to be a more radical Calvinist style of church? The people who pushed for the more Calvinist direction were known as the Puritans later on, but ultimately in the Church of England it wound up being the Royalist people, the more moderate, conservative people who tended to win out, and you wound up with an Anglican church which still remained relatively close to the Catholic type of model. And then finally, in some other places, you had much more radical kinds of groups, right? Sort of Luther and the Anglicans, relatively conservative. You can still have bishops, you can still wear robes, you can still have stained glass, you can still have holidays and all this stuff. Calvinists, more radical, pushing in that kind of a direction. Beyond the Calvinists, you got people who are more radical still, and we sort of group them together, many small groups we call the radical reformers, people who are sort of willing to go to the ultimate extreme in how they wanted to change the church. The most prominent groupings are the what people call the Anabaptists. And what made most of these groups distinct from the other kinds of Protestants, from the Calvinists and Lutherans and Anglicans, was that those more mainstream types of Protestants, we call them the magisterial reformers, they still believed in an idea of a Christian society. They still thought that Christianity was supposed to be the dominant religion of the society, and they still believed you should have some kind of a church that incorporated everybody, embraced everybody, meant for some sort of big collective communal Christian identity. That's the kind of thing we saw in Kaplan's book, Divided by Faith, this idea of Christendom and this idea that religion was supposed to be something that united the whole community together and that everybody had in common, which is why it got such conflicts, why people felt so bitterly when when arguments over religion started dividing people. The Anabaptists rejected that whole idea. When they looked at the Bible, it seemed to them that true Christianity ought to be a kind of a small, heroic, marginal group of outsiders, true believers who were turning their back on the world and focusing on heaven, and you could never expect a whole society, a whole community to organize around that, right? Christianity was only ever going to be for people who had decided of their own free will as adults that they wanted to go pursue some higher heavenly kind of a life and not be entangled in the world, which meant the rest of society around them. That name Anabaptist means people who baptize again, because in the other kinds of Protestant churches as well as in Catholicism, people were usually baptized as children, and that sort of marked them as belonging to the Christian community from birth, and that sort of made the whole community Christian because everybody was baptized. Anabaptists said, we don't think that baptizing children is valid. We think baptism only counts if you baptize an adult, if they come to it of their own free will and they decide for themselves this is something that they want. And so they would go around baptizing people who might already have been baptized as children, saying that earlier baptism didn't count and now you have to be baptized again as an adult. And the Anabaptists tended to try to withdraw from the society around them and form their own kind of separate communities. They would refuse to serve on juries and swear an oath on a Bible saying, that they'll perform the law. This whole sort of idea of swearing oaths people thought was very important to your legal responsibilities and your civic responsibilities. The Anabaptists refused to do that. They refused to participate in town militia service, which if you lived in a medieval town or an early modern town was very often part of your responsibility as a citizen was to show up and serve your shift on the town militia, the town watch, that kind of a thing. They refused to do that. And so a lot of people, both the other kinds of Protestants and the Catholics, saw the Anabaptists as really subversive and kind of a threat to society. They thought these people are going to tear the community apart by refusing to pull their weight and do their bit serving the rest of the society. But it was based on the Anabaptist way of reading the Bible, where they thought sola scriptura, follow the Bible alone, and the Bible's version of Christianity is not something you can apply to the whole world or to the whole community. It only is going to apply to a select few who opt out of society at large. So as the Reformation runs its course through the 1520s, 1530s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and onwards, you wind up with these many different kinds of Protestants, none of them really being the original Protestant church. Luther was the first Protestant reformer, but he was never the founder of all these other Protestant churches. But a lot of people with a few general principles they have in common, sola scriptura, sola fide, but really each taking their own path to carry out what they thought those Protestant ideals really were supposed to mean in practice.